Welcome to this online lesson, the third part of studying weapons and wounds in World War I, gas, and some practice at source work. The aims of this lesson are to gather information on World War I wounds from sources, to follow up at least one source, but you'll probably do more than that, and to evaluate and interrogate sources. Here's a quick do now task. In previous lessons, and if you've not yet watched those and taken part in them, then I'd urge you to do that first. We have studied the risks of bullets, shrapnel, NYDN, which is shell shock, infection and gangrene, trench fever and trench foot. Put these risks in order of danger to the soldiers. Explain your choice, whatever you come up with. Pause the video now. Okay, well, there's not really a right answer to that task. But if we're talking physical danger, probably shrapnel was about as bad as it got because it often led to infection and gangrene as well. You might well have come up with your own answer then. Anyway, let's proceed on to our next horrific way of getting wounded in World War I. Gas, gas, gas. In the photograph at the bottom of the screen, you can see clouds of white vapour advancing across the battlefield. This is an early photograph taken from the air of a gas attack. Early on, gas canisters were opened at one line of trenches with the hope that the wind would carry it across to the enemy. Hardly a reliable method of transmission of the gas. Indeed, a change in the wind, as sometimes happened, was as likely to risk your own men rather than the enemy. Later, gas was delivered in specialised artillery shells, which were more reliable and easier to aim at the enemy. For this task, we're going to have a look at a film. The linked film in the description depicts German soldiers, or at least actors depicting German soldiers speaking English, in the 1979 adaptation of the famous novel All Quiet on the Western Front. However, the experience of gas attacks was similar on all sides. Watch the video clip and answer the following questions. How do the soldiers react to the gas attack? Secondly, how does the gas affect the victim? And thirdly, what might make gas a particularly terrible and terrifying weapon? You might want to note down those questions before you watch the video, but whatever you do, pause the video now, click on the link in the description and answer those questions. So the soldiers react in various ways. Most obviously, they put on gas masks. When gas was introduced in the First World War, such things were not actually available. Quick fixes included urinating on a handkerchief and holding that over your face. The ammonia actually counteracted gases like chlorine to a certain extent, so it was more effective than you might think. Later, both sides were given gas masks or respirators to help, and they fit these in the scene. But also there's an important element of warning here. A soldier warns them by shouting, "Gas, gas!" and the other one makes sure that the other fella is putting on his gas mask at the same time. There's also a bell being rung in the background, which you may have missed. The soldiers then climb out of the safety, or supposed safety, of the shell hole, preferring to be being exposed to fire rather than being the shell craters where the gas collects. Gases like chlorine are heavier than the oxygen in the air, and therefore they tended to settle and sink down for long periods of time in the shell holes until eventually dispersed and blown away. So how does the gas affect the victim? Well, first of all, it affected him very quickly. I believe that this scene is trying to give an impression of chlorine gas, which would have a virtually instantaneous and stinging effect on the person who had it. But other gases like phosgene could be just as deadly, if not worse. So what might make gas a particularly terrible and terrifying weapon? I think part of it is down to the psychological nervousness of when it's going to hit you, the unpredictability of it, but also the fact that it's not a quick death. In fact, it doesn't always kill you at all, but it is virtually always painful and really unpleasant. Victims tended to drown on their own lungs or suffer other terrible debilitating conditions that killed them slowly and in agony, rather than being instantaneous like a bullet to the brain. Let's have a look now at the effects of gas in more detail. Read the information and create a spider diagram with your findings. As a minimum, you should have headings on the following: the types of gas and how each one affected people, how to defend against gas and what was effective, and how deadly each gas was. So let's have a look at the information. You can start to begin this at your own time, and of course you could always choose an alternative method such as index cards if you prefer. So deadly gas was first used near Ypres in 1915. Soon both sides used it. Originally it was released from canisters and drifted on the wind, but later special artillery shells delivered it. One gas was chlorine. This gas suffocated people and caused acid to build up in the lungs. Effectively, they drown on their own breath. Phosgene is the most deadly gas of the First World War and developed specifically for the purpose of killing people. It caused the nerves to shut down. What this meant is that your brain no longer communicated with the organs in your body. So it shut down your breathing, it shut down your heart. Mustard gas was less deadly than either, but it caused horrible blisters on the skin and caused blindness. This photograph here shows temporarily blinded victims of chlorine gas. I say probably temporarily, it depends on your exposure. Sometimes victims could recover from this, sometimes they never did. Gas was truly horrific, and it wasn't as deadly as feared. Around 5% of all British deaths were due to gas. It's still a horrific number, but not as many as might have been. Many victims of the symptoms of chlorine and mustard gas were only temporarily affected. To begin with, urinating on a cloth and holding it over the mouth was the only defence, as the ammonia acted against the chlorine. All of the armies also developed increasingly effective gas masks throughout the war, which, with warning, were very effective at stopping the gas. They did cut down your breathing, your mobility, and definitely your vision, though. So, here we've got some examples of these gas masks. Initially, it's simply a simple face mask with a kind of a fabric goggles arrangement and a gauze that you could soak in a counteracting liquid, not necessarily urine, and place it over the face. Then we can see one of the early whole head gas respirators, which will be even more effective. And then a later British respirator, which is attached to a separate canister, which was carried on the chest. This also acted as the case for the gas mask when it wasn't in use. Oh, and might I note that the horse is wearing a respirator too. Yes, the animals were at risk from the gas just as much as the people, so they were provided with respirators as well. Goodness knows what they thought of wearing them. Anyway, pause the video here and start making your notes. Done? Well, just check that you've got all of the types of gas down: chlorine, phosgene and mustard. Noting down how the people defended against the gas and how deadly the gas was. You'll want to note down the symptoms that it caused. We're now going to have a look at a famous source that relates to the act of being gassed. This is a painting by John Singer Sargent, who was a famous artist of the time who painted a lot of scenes of the war. It was painted in 1919, just after the conclusion of the First World War, probably based upon soldiers' accounts, possibly Singer's own observations, but most likely from photographs. It's a very famous painting, this, and quite a powerful one for showing the effects. You have victims of the gas lying on the ground, but also notice two groups of blindfolded prisoners, with one man leading the rest of them as they go along. The painting was completed in the following circumstances. Sargent was employed by the British government to depict the war. Sargent went out to France to view and sketch scenes of the war, so there is a likelihood that he saw various things like this. Sargent included lots of realistic details. One of the ones I really like here is the exaggerated step of one of the blinded men near the front. He knows that there's a step there because he's just been warned, but because he's blind, he doesn't know how high the step is, and so he lifts his foot up higher than he needs to. Sargent also painted this after the war was over, based upon his notes, sketches, and probably other photographs and sources too. The painting is not of a specific event, it is just representative of gas victims. Here are your follow-up tasks then. Consider the circumstances that this painting was made in. How accurate does the painting appear to be? Explain with examples. What circumstances make the painting A, reliable, or B, unreliable? Explain your views. Then lastly, overall, is gas a useful source for historians studying World War I gas victims? Remember that usefulness is not really the same as reliability. It's about whether it provides us with relevant information that we can trust. Consider real. If you're not sure what I mean by that, I mean relevant information, enough information, the author is trustworthy, and don't forget the limitations. REAL. Pause the video while you complete that. So how accurate was the painting? Well, you know what? It's a fairly naturalistic painting. It's got accurate uniforms, accurate details, and you can compare it to other sources. It's a pretty accurate portrayal of how soldiers behaved after gassing. What circumstances made the painting reliable? Well, Sargent will have viewed possibly pictures like this for himself and made sketches before the war. So he had first-hand experience of seeing things exactly like this. Another thing is the realistic details, like the soldier's step and the accuracy of the uniforms and the general scenery. But what might be unreliable? Well, because this is not of a specific event, it will be a sort of a collection of things that Sargent saw. So although realistic, it doesn't actually show a real event. So perhaps in that respect we can consider it less reliable than a photograph, assuming that photograph isn't posed. So overall, is gas a useful source for historians studying World War I gas victims? Well, you should have identified that yes, it is. I hardly would have given you a useless source when I'm trying to teach you about the effects of gas. A reminder again, if you need, of how real works. Relevant, enough, author and limitations. Improve your answer if you need to, and then we'll move on. We're going to take a moment to have a look at a variety of sources now. These will appear quite small, so make sure that you're playing this in full screen and in high definition to be able to see them as clearly as possible. You can do both of these tasks, or just one, pick and choose as you prefer. However, I would urge you to do both if you're looking at this for the first time rather than revision, because they're all useful. Firstly, we're going to consider how each source is useful, but probably for different things. All sources can be useful if used in the right way. So which of sources A to D is useful for an inquiry into the topics listed here? A. Gas attacks. B. Health problems in the trenches. C. The dangers from artillery. And D. The dangers from infections in wounds. Let's have a look at source A first of all. Soldiers of the East Yorkshire Regiment having their feet inspected by their medical officer near Rodincourt on the 9th of January 1918. This trench looks to be in good condition, with duckboards above the mud to help keep soldiers' feet dry. The insinuation might be that this is a bit of a posed photograph, or that these soldiers probably aren't in too bad a way, although cold weather was definitely when trench foot was most dangerous to the men. Source C is from the diary of Sister Catherine Lord of the Queen Alexandra Nursing Service Sisters, 15th of April 1915. ADMS stands for the Assistant Director, Medical Services. This afternoon, the medical staff of both divisions have been trying experiments in the barn with chlorine gas, with and without different masks soaked with some antidotes such as lime. All were busy choking and coughing when they found the ADMS of the 5th Division getting blue and suffocated. He had had too much chlorine and was brought here looking very bad, and for an hour we had to give him fumes of ammonia till he could breathe properly. He will probably have bronchitis. But they found out what they needed to know, that if you put on this mask, you can go to the assistance of men overpowered by the gas, with less chance of you finding yourself dead too when you get there. Source B, from a report on gas gangrene by Anthony Bowlby, consulting surgeon of the British Army in 1914. And yes, I've realised that I've put the animations in the wrong order. Forgive me. I can't be bothered to fix it now. The gangrene found amongst our wounded soldiers is directly due to the infection introduced at the time of the wound, and it is likely to occur if muddy clothing has been carried into by the projectile, or if earth has been carried by the explosion. And lastly, from the memories of Private Harry Patch, the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, describing the events in 1917. He's actually describing these many years later when he was well into his hundreds. Yes, Harry Patch died aged 113 back in 2009. He was the last British soldier surviving from World War I who died. The shelling was bad. You could hear the big shells coming, although if you could hear them, that was all right. They'd just gone over. You never heard the whiz-bangs coming. They were just there. And you never heard the shell or bullet that hit you. Of course, whiz-bangs were shrapnel, and that was worse than a bullet. A bullet wound was clean. Shrapnel would tear you to pieces. It was a whiz-bang that killed my 3 friends and wounded me. It was just bad luck. They had those 4 ammunition magazines over their shoulders, fully loaded. That's why they all got blown to pieces. Okay, pause the video here and identify which is useful for which topic. You should have identified that source C is useful for gas attacks. What about B? Health problems in the trenches. You should have chosen source A. For part C, the dangers from artillery, source D is most helpful. And the dangers from infections in wounds is from source B. Now you've answered that, choose a quote from each source to support your choice. This quote should show why it is useful for that particular purpose. Now, by doing that, you've chosen specific examples that are related to a particular issue, whether it's gas attacks, health problems in the trenches, dangers from artillery, and so forth. We're now going to put that to use with a particular type of exam skill. There's one question that's only worth 4 marks, doesn't take very long at all, doesn't require much writing, but can really get you into a bit of a pickle if you don't know what you're doing with it. I'm here to tell you that once you get your head round with them, they're pretty easy. So don't allow these questions to eat up too much time in the exam when they're actually pretty straightforward. How could you follow up one of these sources to find out more about World War I treatments? Okay, I've kept that fairly broad because I'm going to give you the option of choosing either source A, source B, source C, or source D. You should write a detail from the source, a question you would ask, a source you would use, and why this source might answer your question. If you're confident on how to approach that, have a go at that now with a source of your choice. If not, in a moment I'm going to show you an example and then you can choose one of the other examples. Okay, pause the video here if you're going to have a go at that. If not, we'll have a look at the example answer to give you a bit of help in how to answer it. Alright then, let's have a look at an example related to source A. How could you follow up source A to find out more about treatments in World War I? In the exam, you'll be provided with a table that looks something like this. Detail in source A I would follow up, question I would ask, type of source I could use, how this might answer my question. Alright, so the detail I chose was this, the doctor treating the soldiers. The question I would ask has got to be about treatments too. Was trench foot always treated at or near the front line? Now, you don't actually need to know the answer to that question. You just need to know the question and phrase it in a way that is relevant to the inquiry. The inquiry, in this case, being treatments in World War I. So what type of source could you use? Well, there's any number of sources you could use, but you can't use the same one. So don't choose a photograph, and definitely don't choose the same photograph, because that's the one that we're interrogating. I might choose this one, the diary of a World War I doctor. And how might that particular source answer your question? Well, the doctor may have described the process and location of trench foot treatments. There we are. Simple. You could choose virtually any legitimate historical source and then explain how it would give you the information there. You can always note this down as an example if you need to. If not, have a go at one of the other ones on your own. You can always flip back a couple of minutes to the screen with all the sources on it if you want to. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a go at one for yourself now. Let's have a look at another example for source B. You don't need to have exactly the same for this, but you should just get an idea for the process. Here's source B. That's the one about gas gangrene. But again, we can use this for treatments too. Many sources have more than one use. But make sure that your question is about treatments in World War I. You could actually repeat this task by choosing one of the other purposes, like finding out about gas. Detail in source B I would follow up. The quote, infection introduced at the time of the wound. The question I would ask, and remember this has got to be about treatments, what did doctors do to try and treat infection once it had taken hold? Type of source that you could use to find out more might be Army medical training books. And how might that answer the question? Such a book may contain instructions on how to treat or prevent infections. In fact, for my history department, I've bought one of these books and I can confirm that it does have details in there. I'm afraid the reading isn't terribly pretty though. There's not a lot that they could do about it. One final one then, source D, from the memories of Private Harry Patch of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. Here he's describing the dangers of artillery. But again, we're going to try and apply this to treatments in World War I. How can we do this? Well, it's not easy, but you can still do it. I would choose this detail, the comparison of bullet and shrapnel wounds. I would then ask the question, were gunshot wounds and shrapnel wounds treated differently? I might look up photographs of soldiers undergoing treatments for both gunshot wounds and shrapnel wounds and compare them. And the photos may contain details that show similarities and differences in treatment. There we go. I've managed to take a source that is more about artillery and still apply it to treatments in World War I. Look for the details. That's the starting point. Finally then, in the last few lessons we've been studying the following. Bullets and shrapnel wounds, infection and gangrene, shell shock, which at the time was called not yet diagnosed nervous, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder today, gas, trench foot, trench fever. Which, if any of these threats, was new in World War I? Which, if any of these threats, was unique to World War I. In other words, it's the only war really where it's taken place, at least on a large scale. And lastly, in your view, which of these threats made World War I particularly horrific? Take a moment to think about that, note down some answers, and then we'll conclude. So what are the new threats in World War I? Bullets and shrapnel wounds have been around for quite a few years, ever since the introduction of firearms in the later Middle Ages. Infection and gangrene had always been a problem in warfare, especially in filthy environments. It was just particularly bad in World War I. It's true as well that even the Romans described things that we would probably today call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men have always been terrified in battle, and so are women and civilians too. But gas was new to World War I, very definitely. It's not the only time it's been used, but it's pretty much the only time it's been used on a large scale. Trench foot had existed before, but it was new in the sense that it had never been quite this widespread before, because frankly, trench warfare had not been this widespread before. As was trench fever. Illnesses had always followed armies, but again, specifically trench fever, or pyrexia of unknown origin as they called it, was pretty much a new phenomenon for World War I. Which of these is unique to World War I? Well, I would argue probably gas. Although we know that chemical weapons have been used in later 20th century wars and even occasionally in the 21st century, it's never been used on quite such a large scale since. Poison gas was used in World War II, but not really on the battlefield. One wonders if Hitler would have deployed poison gas as a battlefield weapon had he not been gassed himself in World War I. But in terms of which one is most horrific, only you can decide that as part of your personal opinion, but just make sure that you're able to support it. For me, I could hardly choose, but I might go for shell shock, especially given how poorly understood it was and how long-lasting its effects could be. But I might change my mind on that. Hopefully you found this lesson useful. If you have, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and best of luck with your studies. Goodbye.